Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Claire Obusan, a senior editor at Bloomberg QuickTake, and today we're going to talk about jobs. Really staggering jobs report that came out this morning in the US. 20.5 million jobs lost, 14.7% unemployment. I mean, the superlatives just keep coming, but really behind all these numbers, there's an individual behind all of these numbers, and it's a scary time for a lot of people. So we thought it would be a good time to have a conversation around job loss, job security, personal finances, given that these are topics that are top of mind for so many people right now. And so I want to begin today's conversation with a couple of guests. So first off, we have Alexis Leondis. She's a columnist at Bloomberg Opinion, and she covers personal finance. And previously, Alexis wrote about personal finance. She led our tax coverage over at Bloomberg News. Now, also joining us from Los Angeles is Khe Hy. He's the creator of Rad Reads and also a consultant, coach, online instructor who writes extensively about personal finance, career pivots, transitions, and the psychology of money. So thank you both so much for joining us today on this topic. So Alexis, I want to start with you. The title of one of your most recent columns, which is what we're calling the Q&A today, here's what to do before you lose your job. It was pretty attention grabbing. What prompted you to write it?
Well, I felt like there was a lot of information out there for people who had already lost their jobs, and a lot of really helpful information about, what to do in terms of filing for unemployment benefits and so forth. But there wasn't that much out there about what to do if you're kind of in what I'm calling like employment purgatory. You still have your job, but you feel like you could be the next shoe to drop. And who knows if that's going to be in 6 weeks or 6 months. But obviously with the job numbers that we're seeing, it's clear that we're seeing second and third waves. And these second and third waves, could stretch into other sectors, whether they're like the first wave was obviously more focused on hospitality, leisure, frontline workers. The second and third waves, according to economists, are going to focus more on the people who are at the managerial level or just in other sectors, and they're part of the supply chains that supply a lot of the industries that are getting hammered. So for all of those reasons, I thought it was really prudent to write a story and target it for people who still have the resources of their employer. They're still gainfully employed, and give them some tips and advice on what to do while they're still employed to take advantage of those resources before it's too late, essentially.
So let's get into that a little bit. Talk us through these steps that you mentioned. Like, what are some of the steps that people can take right now in anticipation of any job loss, furlough, anticipated cut in some form of compensation? Talk to us about some of the things that you laid out.
Sure. The first step is really basic. I mean, it's common sense. You just have to know what you have and you have to know what you're spending. But when you're trying to figure out the former, a lot of people, if you ask them how much they actually make, thanks to things like direct deposit, a lot of us don't know exactly what the bottom line numbers are. So for those reasons, it's really helpful to make sure you're looking at your pay stubs, you're checking out, withholdings, all that stuff to find out what you're actually taking home, biweekly or monthly, whenever you get paid. And it's really important if you're lucky enough to hold on to restricted stock units or you have some kind of deferred compensation plan to get a sense of, if you're terminated, how do those plans work? So exactly what will you get, when you walk out the door? So that's in the first bucket of what you're making, what you have. One other thing that I heard from a lot of people is that, many of us have had different jobs at different employers. We may have retirement accounts at different employers that we've totally forgotten about. So when you're making that list of what you have, be sure you're being really comprehensive and including some of those things you may have forgotten about. And then on the other hand, you want to get a sense of what you're spending and what your monthly outlays are. And I think it's generally very helpful to put those outlays into two buckets: discretionary spending and non-discretionary spending. And in the column, I note that some of the expenses that you've previously thought of as mandatory expenses that are non-negotiable, thanks to the CARES Act, that may have changed. There's mortgage forbearance. If you've lost your job or had some kind of serious reduction in income, there's also deferral of student loan payments. So there are a lot of different things that may be available to you. So it's really important to make sure you understand the provisions in the CARES Act, when the expiration dates of those provisions are, to get a better sense of what discretionary spending is versus non-discretionary. And then for the discretionary spending, all of us are probably relying on takeout and other kinds of things, which are obviously very important to help keep our favorite restaurants in business. But those expenses add up. So if you're really concerned about having a big change in terms of your income, then it's important to take a look at those things.
Okay, I see you nodding. I know this is something you've written so much about. Tell us, like, for our audience, also tell us a little bit about like your experience. I'll let you describe it in your own words, but kind of going from, a corporate job into being self-employed and like having to really reevaluate your situation. Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. And so, I think back to this time because 2008, I was in my 30s. And so these like having lived through two crises, I'm like, okay, I think I've seen this before. Except in one, I had health insurance, a paycheck, a structure. And in this kind of second phase of my life, I've been a solopreneur, a digital creator, you'd say, for almost 5 years now. And so, I had always braced. I joke, or I implore my readers to always have the two numbers that they talk about, and it actually with their partners and just have in their head. And it jives with what Alexis said. It's like, what's the spending that you could cut overnight? And you'd be amazed with the number of people that have no idea. They're well-employed, smart finance people who have no idea how much they spent in 2019. So that's the first number. That's a more of a defensive number. And then the second is like an offense number. And the offense number is if you could just kind of categorically look through your brokerage accounts and say, I have 50% of my life exposed in stocks. What would happen if those were down 40%, 50%? Just pick your favorite crisis and just know right away, okay, if you have 50% of your assets in equities and it's going to lose 50%, you're going to wake up one morning and you would have lost 25% of your net worth. How are you going to act in that situation? Do you regret buying that house in that situation? And so again, they're just like quick little heuristics so that when the moment comes, right, a crisis will come, another one will come, you're kind of prepared to, at least you're mentally prepared for what's going to come from it.
So I just want to bring in, we're just getting a question right now from the audience. And so I'm going to pose this to Alexis first, and Khe, feel free to weigh in. And so the question is, if I get laid off, what should I do with my 401k?
Sure. So there are two things to keep in mind. The first is that under the CARES Act, so typically pre-CARES Act, if you were to take a withdrawal before you're 59 and a half from your 401k, it generally comes with a 10% penalty. So obviously it's a way to prevent people from doing that, except in dire situations. Under the CARES Act, it waives that 10% penalty. So you can actually take a withdrawal if you need to set up, an emergency fund or have extra savings built up because you anticipate you're going to lose your job or you already have. You can basically, again, take that withdrawal up to 100,000. You have to repay it within 3 years, but you won't be hit with that 10% penalty. So that's one thing. The other thing, some of the advisors that I spoke to for my column highlighted is that think about what the balance is of that 401k. And if you have more than $5,000 in your account, then you actually can leave it there. You don't have to take it with you right away. And a lot of advisors suggest that that's actually a good thing, because often what happens is people pull the money and then they don't reinvest it right away, and they miss out on some of the market rebound. So for those reasons, you want to think about what the balance is, and if it's over a certain amount, potentially keep it there until you're ready to roll it over to an IRA so you don't miss out on any market upswing.
Okay, do you have anything to add?
Oh, yeah, I would add just one quick thing is, in Claire's introduction, she said I write about the psychology of money. So Alexis will cover the logistics of the CARES Act and all that. But I think the psychology is, think about are you doing it are you redeeming it because of fear? Like market fear, bear market fear, or are you doing it because you actually need the cash? And those are going to be two very different considerations. You might get so caught up in the whirlwind and the fear, right? Genuine fear of what's happening right now, that there's famous 3 words in investing: this time it's different. As a 41-year-old, having lived through 3 bear markets, like, trust me, every one was different. And so I would just encourage you to kind of check yourself in a kind and compassionate way, that you are doing this because you fundamentally need the money, which leads to the first point, like, do you know what your spending is, your burn rate is? Or are you caught in the emotion and of the moment? And that you might want to take a few deep breaths before you liquidate for that second reason.
Awesome. That's really great. And so I just want to also bring up another question, open to either of you if you want to take it. So the question is coming from our audience, and and person's asking, and this is actually a good topic. I think it's a good segue into the topic about networking and job hunting when it's entirely virtual, right? The traditional avenues of looking for work are different now. It's gone. So the question is, how can I make my resume stand out during this time?
I'll gladly jump on that one.
Okay.
So for context, right, 5 years ago, I was at BlackRock in an investment role, and I quit with no plan. And we could talk about digital entrepreneurship and making rash decisions like that if our listeners are interested. But what I found was I had to build a whole new set of relationships. I was entering a new industry. I was becoming a writer. My world was migrating online. And there was always this taboo. I would say when I fly into a new city, half of the people I meet in that new city are friends from Twitter. And immediately I get these strange reactions like, what are you doing? How do you even start that conversation? Are you that creepy guy that slides into DMs? And well, fast forward to today, like that's the playing field, right? That is the only way to network. And there are incredible stories of people who are from completely atypical backgrounds to a specific industry that just started sharing interesting information on a social media platform. With time, caught the eye of a few kind of thought leaders in that space. Eventually, they converted those into full-time jobs. So I'm a big believer that fostering genuine relationships digitally through social media can be a phenomenal networking strategy. And by the way, it's the only one right now. And so that is something. And again, I think a lot of it starts, I think people always say like, well, I have nothing to add to the conversation. And I think back to this piece of advice that I heard Bill Gates say once is like, he said, everyone always has something to add to me. An 18-year-old has something to add to me, to Bill Gates. And what's that? It's perspective. Bill Gates will never know what it's like to be an 18-year-old. And so an 18-year-old telling him how he sees the world, how she thinks about technology, those are the types of things that are actually very valuable to your network. And so think about that as you engage with social media digitally.
That's really good to know. I know, Khe, and it kind of brings to mind what you were saying. It's sort of like you and feel free to correct me, but it's something you said that stuck with me. It's like no one really cares what you've done in the past, right? It's if you have something to offer right now, and you're willing to share it with people, there will be people who will want to hear what you have to say, who want to give you a chance, right?
Absolutely. And I think of there's a gentleman on Twitter by the name of Jamie Catherwood, I believe, and he was just like a history buff, a financial history buff with no financial services experience, and he just started writing these posts about these like crashes from 350 years ago that I had never even heard of and really actually don't care much about, but little by little, like there's a lot of financial history buffs and they started to watch his work, and people then started just rooting for him because he was so passionate about this thing, and he turned that into a marketing job at a quant firm. And this is someone completely outside of the traditional path.
That's a nice segue to another thing that has come up, and I think so again, a nice segue into this and the role of side hustles. And so, Alexis, in your piece, in your reporting for the piece, you mentioned that all the financial planners that you talked to actually talked about the importance of a side hustle. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. They all emphasize the importance of a reserve fund, and however you build that up is really, really important. And especially to try to build it up preemptively, ideally before you lose your job, is one way to do that. So you can do things like, if you're lucky enough to own your own home, you can try to tap the equity in your home through a home equity line of credit or a cash out refi. Keep in mind, those are a lot harder to come by now, and the credit requirements have been tightened. But other things you can do, back to the side hustle, is to think about what else you're really good at. And at least, again, while you're trying to bridge the gap until you get another job, are able to find employment next, that being able to fall back on those side hustles and be able to generate enough income, ideally to put into that emergency fund, is a really smart maneuver.
Okay, and I'm going to bring it back to Khe, because I know you've written so much about the side hustle, and I think you call it like diversifying your identity. Tell us a little bit more about, like, from your perspective.
Yep. Don't do it. No. I'm going to speak from both sides of my mouth, because I have made a career, a financially sustainable, and we can talk about what I deem to feel like anti-fragile career through various modes of digital entrepreneurship. So I'm a huge evangelist of it and supporter of it. But from the other side of my mouth, I'm going to say it took me 5 years of writing 2 to 3 hours a day for 7 days a week, 5 straight years. So there is, like, it doesn't just show up, right? Becoming a digital entrepreneur is not that silver bullet that, like, all of a sudden, yes, Google was started during the dot-com crisis, and Facebook was starting during 2008. But that is what I'll say. But the thing that I love about digital entrepreneurship is that it's really like it's the kiddie pool for a variety of different skills and diversifying your skill set. So let's take an example. One of the easiest ways to make digital revenue is to sell a template online. That sounds like so crazy. Like, who would buy a fancy spreadsheet? But people do that all the time for workouts pre-coronavirus. So you could buy like a 10-tab spreadsheet of like different workout plans. Do you like CrossFit? Do you like yoga? And so on. And for like $10. And again, no one's going to retire and live in New York City or LA doing selling $10 templates. But the minute you create a $10 template, then you need to name it something. Oh, that's like, and put on your branding hat. Then you need to like find distribution, put on your audience development hat, put on your social marketing hat. Then you need to price it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that little project that is like this $10 thing that maybe your mom, your cousin, and like one high school random friend will buy, doesn't seem like a big deal. But when you realize that you learn product design, branding, and audience development on your own dime, then that's a really, really powerful skill set. And then you do that over a year, 2 years, 3 years, 6 years, 10 years, then you become a digital entrepreneur.
So, Khe, you just mentioned a term which, again, segues nicely into the next topic that I wanted to talk about. And I know that's something you've written about recently on your blog, and it's the building an anti-fragile career, which, how do you do that now in sort of this climate? And like, so talk a little bit about it. I think we were sort of getting into that. So it feels like a good segue into that.
Absolutely. I think of it as two ends of the continuum, because in one regards, there are those companies that are known to kind of lay off like every year they lay off the bottom 10%. And so if you can invert that, if you're in the top 10% of your peer group, you're probably going to be the last person to be laid off. But that's not something we can talk about today for tomorrow, but that's something we can talk about for today for the next 5 years, right? So how do you become a top 10% in your industry? But so we talked about the defensive side, like, do you know your cash? Do you know, like, do you have runway? We talked about the more aspirational side, like, are you in the top 10% of your skills, like skill development? But then, like, in the middle, again, I think that there is, like diverse, like repositioning of skills. Right. I think so let's take something like you might have been in HR where the function might have been quite traditional. And then all of a sudden, like, I know it, like, mental wellness is becoming a huge part of HR. Mental wellness in the face of remote work, in the face of a global pandemic. Like, sure, HR professionals are trained for that, are best positioned to tackle that, but that's open field, right? I mean, this is just, no one thought that we might be working remotely till September, till some companies have said January, right?
Yeah.
There's no playbook for that. That is the opening to kind of raise your hand and say, you know, these are these questions. They're happening in this space. They're happening with my colleagues. They're happening with my peers. I could see them coming down from HR. I have a personal opinion on these things. How do I triangulate them and, you know, share them with the right people? Because that's the kind of stuff that's going to get you noticed. And by the way, when there's these giant tectonic societal shifts, there's giant opportunity, especially for kind of the first movers that kind of like rebuild the pieces off of a crisis.
So Alexis, I do want to, you know, we've talked a lot about, and like, you know, sort of positioning yourself defensively and in, you know, when you are in a position to, but, and again, and this is really for both of you as well, but, you know, what are some of the steps for people who don't have the luxury to prepare, that find themselves in the situation where, okay, right now I got to play defense and I got to figure it out today, you know? Is there anything that would be different in terms of what you've laid out in your column?
Sure. The one thing that I should have added before is, while you are still employed, on the health insurance front, you should really be taking advantage of that health insurance. So, you know, get appointments in while you can. Obviously, most doctors' offices aren't open, or they're not doing stuff that isn't essential. But once they start opening, or take advantage of telemedicine, that's really, really important. Fill those prescriptions, do all that sort of stuff before you're no longer employed. Then once you've been laid off, and you aren't able to take advantage of those resources, obviously figure out on the health insurance front whether you're going to purchase insurance through the exchanges or you're entitled to COBRA. You know, figure out what those payments are going to be, because they actually can be pretty substantial, especially if you have dependents. And then unemployment benefits. You know, part of the CARES Act, there's an extra $600 stipend. So that's something that people should be aware of too. Make sure you're getting exactly, you know, what you're eligible for. Those would be the main things. The other thing I wanted to raise too, 529 payments. That's the kind of thing I hear again and again, that again, unless you have, your child is like 16 or 17 and is just a year or two away from college, but that seems to be in the hierarchy of payments that you're making, you know, to 401ks or other accounts. Seems like the 529, it's totally fine to pause those payments, because especially if you've been laid off already, you have more essential things, you know, that you want to think about, like your mortgage or food, and obviously very basic things. So don't feel too bad about pausing that temporarily. And the, you know, the penalties for doing so, you can easily catch up. So it's not so big.
Okay, anything to add from a, you know, so from sort of a job hunting reassessment type?
Yeah, I would add two things. The first is, I would add, like, who's your squad, right? I always ask people, if you're down, if you're down financially, health wise, who's going to go to bat for you, right? And I think if you think of the long game of anti-fragility, you've been, you know, you're not going to call someone you haven't spoken to in 10 years and say like, hey, I need a favor right now. But like, write it. I believe in like a very systematic way of writing this down step by step. Like, these are the 5, 10, 15 people that can help me. You know, if I feel like I'm in a precarious situation, start planting the seed, obviously confidentially. So on, ask them who you should talk to, what opportunities they're seeing. You know, get ahead of it through relationship building, genuine relationship building. The second is that from an economic perspective, this crisis is creating a lot of companies that are doing really well, and industries that are doing really well, and industries that are doing really poorly. So one very simple thing would be to look at all the companies that have raised venture funding during the pandemic. They're playing from a sign of strength. You know, I could think of two, you know, Notion and Stripe raised large rounds, late stage rounds. With every $50 million round, there's 50 new jobs across marketing, comms, finance. You know, just because it's a tech company, late stage tech companies hire, you know, everything from office managers to paralegals to front-end engineers. So look for the pockets of strength. And now, by the way, everything is remote, or a lot more is remote, that, you know, that company that you didn't want to work for in Chicago might actually be open to you working remotely. No offense to Chicago.
No, that's Chicago. We're getting a couple more questions here. So Alexis, this one is for you. The question coming from the audience is, if I get laid off, do I need to consult a lawyer?
I would say it depends what your role is and how kind of complicated your exit package is going to be. So I think certainly if you're in an executive type role and there are lots of moving parts as part of your exit package, then yes, because I think it's very true that kind of the first moments after you're terminated or you get the call, that's when things are most fluid and most negotiable. So I think it would be very helpful if you've been speaking to an employment lawyer to kind of just, again, get a sense of what you're entitled to, what you aren't, so you can try to negotiate those things initially, right before you even walk out the door and things have been more set in stone. So that I think would be the general rule of thumb. If, again, you don't have that complicated a package or it's pretty straightforward, then it's probably not necessary pay legal fees.
All right, very good advice. And so we have time for just one more question. So I'm going to pose it to both of you. We'll start with Khe. And so the question we're getting from the audience is, share your best tip for a virtual job interview.
Ooh, that's a good one. Good lighting and good sound. No, that's not my answer. I would say, when you communicate via Zoom or digitally, a lot of the nuance of like body language gets lost. So just it's be yourself more, like ask more questions. Like you have to overcompensate for the lack of subtle bodily cues with language. And I think that's okay. Just be genuine, be more curious, like ask a little bit more, like how's your day, how's your day going? How are you doing today? Things like that. And then I would also flip it. And I think this is not just for virtual, handwritten thank you notes. Think about it. You get 100 emails a day, 1,000 things in your stream. How many times does someone send you a hand-addressed letter to you, especially in a time when we're all home? That thing jumps to the top of the queue no matter what. So send a handwritten note even when you're not in a quarantine.
That's really good advice. Alexis, anything to add here on one final note?
Sure, I would say keep your children entertained with an iPad.
Which we're all doing right now. Guys, we've just run out of time, but this has been a great conversation. Thank you both so much for joining us. So I want to thank Alexis Leondis, Bloomberg Opinion columnist, for joining us, and also Khe, who's joining us from Los Angeles. He's the creator of Rad Reads. Again, thank you so much for such informative conversation, especially in a time like this. So I just want to remind everyone who is watching that you can follow our ongoing coverage of the coronavirus pandemic and the economy on Bloomberg QuickTake on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and subscribe to our daily newsletters so you can get a roundup of all the top stories in your inbox. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.